Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis, a series of casual conversations on the most important events in the Middle East and North Africa region today. I'm Brian Katulis, a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute, and today I'm joined by a very special guest, Barbara Leaf, a former senior Foreign Service officer, ambassador, who served as the top diplomat for the Middle East at the State Department in the Biden administration. Welcome to the podcast, Barbara.
Thank you, Brian.
We're meeting here at a very particular and unique set of circumstances here in Washington. We're recording this about 2.5 weeks into the second Trump administration, and he's already taken some major steps, including moves to shut down the U.S. Agency for International Development completely and cutting staffing in key parts of the federal government, including in national security institutions. I want to start here because you've spent nearly all of your career in public service, including 3.5 decades representing America in the Foreign Service. What can you say about this current moment and what Trump is doing? How does this impact the sense of public service and what those you've worked with are trying to do on the front lines of what America's facing in the world today?
Well, look, I would say it's a deeply troubling moment. Let me leave aside for the moment the issue of morale and how all of this is affecting personnel within the national security community within the U.S. government. That's an important piece, but it's not the main story. The main story is that we are disabling ourselves. We are depriving ourselves of one of the most important national security tools that we have, which is foreign assistance. Through 60-some years, the USAID has been the principal conveyor of that foreign assistance. It's not the only one. Other agencies, including state, take part in that. But it has the lion's share of the responsibility for that. And in fulfilling its mission, it is a key actor in the national security space, mitigating disease, ending conflicts, mitigating the effects of conflicts, fighting the scourge of poverty, of lack of education, of lack of development around the world. And in doing so, keeping the threats from the U.S., from the American doorstep, including waves of migration, which should be of concern to this administration.
Yeah. So when you first heard this news and you were covering the Middle East from Morocco to Iran was the region that you were responsible for at the State Department, what were the flashpoints? What were the things that you thought, oh my gosh, this is going to impact these people in this part of the world and this will directly impact U.S. national security?
One of the first places I thought of was Syria. My last foreign trip as assistant secretary included a day trip to Syria. I've covered Syria from many different vantage points and spent a lot of time looking at the critical role of the U.S. military, a small mission that we have in northeast Syria, coupled with USAID and state officials who do really important stabilization work and counter-ISIS work. ISIS is far from a depleted organization. In fact, it risks regenerating more rapidly within the context of Syria's current transition. And I hope we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But from one day to the next, assistance has been frozen. That assistance helps people manage a community of some 46,000 ISIS family members in 2 camps. Guards walked off their duty. Critical supplies of food and water were halted for 3 days. And now there has been a sort of 2-week reprieve, but the NGOs in that stretch of land really don't know what to do. And so before long, we're going to have a major national security threat.
So in our political debates here in America, sometimes people think of development aid and humanitarian aid as just handouts, as helping people in other countries. And what you're saying is this will directly impact something that was a threat to U.S. national security interests for a decade.
Absolutely.
And you would say that this amounts to unilateral disarmament of an essential tool that we have.
Worse, it can act as an accelerant to threats that we have kept at bay.
I want to talk a little bit about Syria. I know you talked to Robert Satloff in an excellent interview. I think people can look up. When you went in there, I have to say I was really inspired about how you did that. And given the politicization of so many things these days, including when Benghazi happened more than a decade ago and took the life of capable diplomat, someone whom I think you knew very well. Took a lot of brave risk for you to do this. How did you actually execute this? Did you have to spend a lot of time on the ground, and where did you stage? And
Well, in fact, I and Daniel Rubenstein, who was also asked to go on this mission by Secretary Blinken, and Roger Carstens, Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, and Jemana Kadur, who is a dear friend and colleague and Syrian American herself. We spent about a week in Amman waiting every day for Washington to give us the green light. And we did a lot of prep work with each passing day. Roger had a very special and critical mission, of course, to look for any evidence, any trace, even to find Austin Tice, an American who had been missing in Syria for 12 years, and other Americans who had disappeared into the cauldron of that conflict. And Daniel and Jemana and I had the mission to do outreach and to meet the strongman of Syria, the liberator of Syria, Abu Muhammad Jalani. So we spent a lot of time that week prepping, talking to Syrians, talking to contacts, longstanding contacts for many of us in Syria, and getting ourselves ready sort of mentally for what we knew was going to be possibly dangerous, but also deeply exciting.
yeah, this was one of these black swan events people talk about. Totally a big surprise for you and this change in Syria. And I know the Biden administration, in its closing weeks, had talked about how the Middle East itself had been through a very difficult period, the Israel-Hamas war, what had happened in the conflict in Lebanon, but it had changed the landscape quite a lot. And there's a moment of opportunity that was described, particularly with Iran on its back heels and losing a lot of its proxies. Going back to the earlier question about the Trump administration's decision to freeze aid, how does this impact America's ability to shape that landscape broadly, not just in Syria, but also in Lebanon and other places?
Well, look, I look at the last 15 months, 16 months as having been full of a series of black swans. You think about a black swan event coming once in a generation. We had 3, 4, 5 of them crowd into that space of time. Yes, you had the terrible and terrifying attack by Hamas, a combined arms assault by an army of terror on Israel, and all the events and all of the implications of that. You then had, over the course of that time, Hamas basically taken apart as an army by the IDF. That was the first one. Followed closely on the heels by two really significant decisions by the supreme leader and the regime in Tehran to do what I thought at the time was just profoundly stupid, which was to launch the first state-on-state attacks by Iran on Israel. And they got pounded in turn. And they, over time, began to lose that iron ring of proxies around Israel. Then you have the dismantling of Hamas. And then finally, you have that fourth black swan, regime change comes to Damascus. So what has that done? First of all, it is, as you said, transformed the landscape and completely altered the relationship between Syria and Lebanon for the first time in 4 decades, where the Syrian intel military regime apparatus is no longer essentially a predatory feature of the political landscape, smothering any agency or sovereignty in Lebanon. So you have those two pieces of the threat landscape changed. Mm-hmm. And the threat landscape, of course, intrudes upon Israel's security, but also on Jordan's, on Iraq's, on Turkey's, and wider. So there are huge opportunities here. And as you said, Iran itself has been totally discombobulated. And in many in a sort of a cosmic sense, its status as this colossus astride the region has been completely shattered.
Yes.
So the moment is now. Syria itself is a greenfield.
Yes.
Lebanon as well. You have to have a readiness to engage diplomatically, full bore. You have to use every tool at your disposal, including aid. And let me go to Lebanon. Part of the whole ceasefire piece depends on two things that I've just mentioned. full-bore engagement, diplomatic engagement by the U.S. in the task forces that has been set up, the monitoring mechanism.
Yes.
It's a very labor-intensive job.
Can I pause there? Can you describe a little bit about this? Because you guys moved pretty quickly in December to set up a framework for engaging.
That's right. Well, there are many moving parts, but you have a civilian and military U.S. and civilian and military piece with the French that is there to monitor the withdrawal and any fouls that any party commits along the way. But a key piece of all of this is getting, in fact, you could say the key piece is getting the Lebanese armed forces to deploy into that space that Hezbollah has been pushed out of, that it has vacated. And to do so, it needs a lot more funding and support and pressure, friendly pressure, but pressure to keep doing its job. All of that, the funding, where is it going to come from? It's all been halted. And on the other side of the border, you've got Syria, and as I just described, you've got the critical piece in northeast Syria. But Syria itself is transformed, and it is a green field that will not be green for long.
Right.
And you need assistance. You need, again, full-bore diplomatic engagement. At least from my perspective, we would make a great mistake. The administration would make a great mistake in not pursuing that. And as far as I know, there is no such engagement going on right now.
Now, when I heard about this freeze, I thought about that movie Charlie Wilson's War at the end of it, where it's the story of the U.S. engagement with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And the movie ends, with Tom Hanks' movie, with essentially no funding going to support the people of Afghanistan. And I thought, well, this could be a similar repeat. I don't know if you agree with that analogy, because essentially Israel, for the most part, conducted the military operations in Lebanon and in other places. But who's going to backfill?
Well, but there's an interconnectedness here. So yes, it's absolutely true that the IDF and the Israeli Air Force, Shin Bet, etc., the combined resources, military and security of Israel battered progressively its main adversaries and thrashed them soundly. We enabled that. And not just by the provision of arms, by having a protective overwatch, if you will.
Right.
Israel is now at a point where it has achieved really astounding military results, but it must capitalize on them politically. And in the same way, the U.S. must capitalize. And that doesn't come out of thin air.
Right.
You must act to capitalize on those benefits. We benefited from that steady attrition of that ring of proxies, including the effect that it had, the demonstration effect it had on the Iraqi militias, which scampered out of Syria. The IRG fled in disarray. So for the first time, U.S. forces in Syria, U.S. forces in Iraq for a prolonged period of time now are not under attack by these militias. And they have hit pause in no small part because they have seen what happened to Iran, what happened to its proxies, and the fact that Iran in the end did not come to anybody's rescue.
Right. So I know prediction is difficult, especially about the future, but the Trump administration 2.0, if you were to predict, you already said there's no sign yet that they're going to deeply engage on Syria. You know some of the people who may or may not be going in. We all know a lot of the folks that have been named. Do you have a sense of where this administration might take this issue of how do you engage these countries in this competition with Iran?
So you're right that personnel is policy often. And you can see where policy might go by the selection of people that are brought into staff positions. There are many positions that still are not staffed, which is itself a great and significant problem in terms of picking up these various policies and actions or initiatives that were begun under the Biden administration and handed off like a set of batons to the Trump administration. Now, it's not to say that President Trump and his team are obliged in any way to follow the lead of what the Biden administration done. Although I will say, give full credit for the connectedness that was manifest between the negotiating teams, the outgoing and the incoming, and that did deliver the first phase of this three-phase ceasefire deal. We all know that President Trump came in to office with an aim that he'd had in his first term, which is to be the godfather of a normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and with Saudi Arabia perhaps bringing a set of other Muslim countries in the region and outside. The problem is with all of that, and then let us not forget Iran, and I'll just put an asterisk over that and come back to that in a moment. But if you stick just to the issue at hand, which is making that great deal, it is very much entangled in the Gaza ceasefire and wither. Meanwhile, as I said, Lebanon and Syria present for the moment these green fields of opportunity, which may regenerate as threats if left unattended. So how is he going to sort this all out? It's still quite unclear. And you have very divergent, in some ways, contradictory impulses among some of the staffing that has been put in place.
Yeah, we see that. And we put out at the Middle East Institute a report that I co-wrote with Alex Vatanka and Patricia Karam called Beyond Maximum Pressure. And we talked about the Iran problem, not solely from the nuclear program, but what Iran has done in the region and how America can compete with that influence in the region. And this is why I wanted to stress a little bit more this point, based on your experience. We've got to engage Syria. We've got to use those tools that are now on pause for Lebanon and other places, that if we don't do this, we're actually undercutting our own security interests in that competition.
Yeah, I absolutely believe this. And look, the old adage, nature abhors a vacuum. Somebody will fill that vacuum, assuredly. Or there will be just a sort of generalized disintegration, chaos, etc. And this region has a lot to offer, and it has a lot to offer in terms of threats that we've seen in the past.
Yeah. So it's a little unknown about Trump's full Middle East team, but we do know one individual publicly, and you worked with him. He's been named Tim Lenderking to sort of keep things together. How do you imagine, I don't know if you're talking with him, but how do you think he's dealing with this situation right now and dealing with transitions? Because it's been a most unusual transition from one administration to the next. Yes, cooperation on the ceasefire deal, which was amazing, but then you all had to deal with landing teams and the usual chaos of a transition. Tim is acting as that glue to try to keep it all together, correct?
Yes, he is. And he has my extraordinarily capable principal deputy assistant secretary, Henry Wooster, who himself has spent much time in the region and really has a steady pair of hands. They both do. Tim, of course, has enormous experience in the Gulf and on Yemen in particular. He was named as our special envoy for Yemen, and really did tremendous work over this last 4 years. The Houthi problem set in the Red Sea is by no means resolved, but not for lack of trying under Tim's leadership. But I would just say, until you have a confirmed nominee in the assistant secretary position, but also across the building, and the 7th floor filled out, it's going to be very difficult to maneuver, to keep the trains running on time is the simplest thing you can do. But you've got to do more than just keep your embassies, your diplomatic missions operational. You want to take advantage, again, of the opportunities that are there. But it's hard to do when you do not have confirmed people in all of these places.
You have that, and then you also have billionaire Elon Musk with the Department of Government Efficiency and this shutdown of USAID that seems to be happening. And latest news, as far as we could tell, is overseas employees have been told to come home within 30 days.
They've all been told to come home.
So imagine sort of being in Tim Lenderking's spot right now and trying to manage day to day these pieces.
Hugely stressful. And really hard to focus on. There is the constant dilemma between focusing on the urgent versus the important. I would argue there's an urgency and a huge importance to the issues that we've just talked about, this changed landscape.
Right.
But you don't have the mechanisms, the tools to go after this. And then you have this upheaval that we see across the federal government. It's not just at state. It's certainly not just at USAID, although it, as an agency, appears to be in the process of simply being shuttered. Now, is that for 3 months? Is that, at best, as a starting point to a messy assimilation into state. What I do fear is a huge loss of vital human capital in that process.
Yeah, and that undercuts U.S. national security. I think we have to talk about it, and it's these statements that President Trump made when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in town, and the assertion that the United States was going to take control of Gaza. Now, again, and you've talked in other interviews about how challenging the war between Israel and Hamas was, how it was difficult just to get to a vision for the end game with all of our partners and things like this. What do you make of these statements? And I know we're all trying to assess, and I know King Abdullah of Jordan is also visiting as well. So what's your take on why he does this, and how do you assess it?
Look, there are there are a range of possibilities, among which is it's an opening gambit to something larger, which again goes back to this issue of the quest for a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the Palestinians clearly are a feature of that deal, at least as far as the Saudis are concerned. Possibly that's some sort of opening gambit. I can't really take it seriously as a policy proposal because, first of all, the last time I checked, the United States is not going to engage in ethnic cleansing. And that's what it would be.
Yeah.
It would be forced displacement of Palestinians from their own land.
Yeah.
And that's not something that I think the U.S. will engage in. And if it does so, it will not find willing partners to assist it. But leaving that aside, I also don't for a moment think there's anyone there that there is support for this in the American public that would come at the not just the cost but the loss of enormous blood and treasure.
Right. Yeah.
There is a thriving, a battered but still thriving, still extant terrorist organization in the Gaza Strip, and that's Hamas.
Right.
And Hamas will have a vote. So I don't see it as a serious operational policy. I have to assume it's some sort of negotiating gambit.
Yeah, so you have some visibility on the ceasefire agreement and hostage. It was basically Biden's template, as far as I understood it, right? Spring of 2024, he publicly issues a three-phase plan. My take on it was that because of the different hedging by the parties to the negotiation, he wanted to say, here's a bigger framework for it. And more or less, I think the deal that was struck was this confluence of the Trump teams coming in, the Biden teams coming out. People want hostages to come home. So we have a deal. But a lot of people think that deal, phase one.
We have a deal just for one phase.
Phase one, yeah.
And now we're going to meet that moment where, that's been my feeling all along, there is a deep structural flaw in the whole construct. And what is that flaw? As of Monday, the teams were supposed to begin meeting on setting the terms for phase two, which would be to set the terms for the final arrangements, security, governance, reconstruction of Gaza. Why would we have a construct where Hamas gets to negotiate that with Israel? In fact, it won't get done.
Right.
They have wholly irreconcilable aims, mutual destruction, but certainly any Israeli leader, not just the prime minister, will tell you that they want to destroy Hamas completely as an organization, not just get at its ability to threaten Israel, which they've done very handily, but also destroy it permanently as a movement. You can't do that wholly by military means, and you certainly can't negotiate Hamas's surrender. Hamas will not surrender. So I think part of what you heard on January 14th in Secretary Blinken's last public speech addressing this set of issues was, and I think if I recall correctly, he said, as he has said many times, Hamas is an idea. It's a movement. It's an idea. You can't fight something with nothing. You have to have that alternative. And the alternative, however flawed, is there. It's the Palestinian Authority. Who else would you negotiate with? So I don't think they will get to phase two.
So as you just mentioned, the ceasefire is pretty fragile. Big questions of whether we'll get from phase one to phase two requires a lot. Another aspiration President Trump has is Israel-Saudi normalization accord. And I know you and the Biden administration were working hard on it, trying to produce a pathway, particularly before October 7th. There were certain signals that people were sending. There was some hope that there might be an opening for that. There was a lot of work done by the Biden administration to get there. Tell the listeners what you think the prospects are, given the Trump administration's positioning early days on the Gaza question and where the Palestinian Authority is and the two-state solution. Is a two-state solution a key ingredient for the Saudis, or do you think that, as many people think, or some people, not many, that you could somehow get something that's minus a two-state solution that brings the Saudis on board?
So look, first of all, you start with the proposition that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, made clear pretty early on that he was not wed to the Saudi 2002 initiative, the Arab Peace Initiative, which required that a fully formed state be born, and then on the heels of that would come normalization by Saudi Arabia and others. Obviously, that model was broken in 2020 by UAE and Bahrain, but the Saudis MBS made clear himself that he was open to a different approach. But what I would say is we got pretty far along the road just before October 2023,
Yeah.
October 7th. But one of the key pieces, which was still in a very nascent form, was what we were calling the Palestinian component. What would be the pieces that would be necessary to be a sort of down payment, start a process that would take a credible process and time-bound, conditions-based. The typical questions were there on the table, but how to lay out a roadmap to statehood that would be credible enough, as the Crown Prince made clear, for his own public.
Yeah.
And he was very conscious of the responsibility that he had as a ruler to his own public. Now, that conversation in the aftermath of October 7th, and as the conflict deepened and the destruction deepened, the Crown Prince showed greater and greater sensitivity to this issue. And he made clear he had to think about what it would cost him, even in security terms, threats to his life, were he to agree to something that was not credible for the Palestinians, was rejected by the Palestinians. That discussion between or through the U.S., virtually between the Saudis and Israelis, had not taken place. So there is still profound amounts of work to be done in that space, which is, again, not to say that the Trump administration has to follow the same playbook.
Right.
But what we have heard consistently from the Crown Prince and publicly is that the price has risen on the Palestinian component.
Well, the math equation I've wondered is you got an Israeli government that includes some figures who reject even the notion of their Palestinians being there, right? And someone who want to annex the West Bank and even take over the Gaza Strip. How do you think the Saudis might react to that? I know that's a speculation question, but what do you think? Does it add up to something that they'd want to embrace?
I think annexation and certainly displacement of Palestinians from Gaza would end any near-term prospect for normalization. He's been very clear on that. But he's also been clear that if it's not now, because the Israelis are not in a place to do it because of their own political math or what have you, he is not in a hurry.
Yeah. Yeah. He has a lot of going on. He's trying to
He
reform
has
his economic system.
Number one focus is Vision 2030, his socioeconomic revolution from above.
Great. Thanks for that. I want to take a step back and have you look back on a very long and storied career. And really, you served not just in the Middle East, but in the war zones of the former Yugoslavia. You were in Iraq, you were in other places. But we're at the Middle East Institute. Would love to hear, as you reflect on this distinguished career, what are some of the bigger picture lessons learned, advice that you would give to future generations for those who want to go into the Foreign Service like you did, but big policy questions? What are the things that you're most proud of? And then what are the things that we didn't get right, but it's an important lesson learned that we can apply for the future?
So I'll start with, what did I learn from this 30-plus year career, from my first assignment in Port-au-Prince until my last assignment. It may sound a bit cliched, it's a truism, but it's true. U.S. leadership and engagement counts so much. And where it's missing, terrible things happen, which is not to say we always get it right. And we got it terribly wrong in 2003 in invading Iraq and in the subsequent years where we really mangled the post-conflict arrangements. In fact, we didn't have any.
Right.
We had no phase 4 planning in military terms. And a lot of people suffered, the Iraqis most of all, but we lost a lot of good men and women on the battlefield because of it. And Iraq suffered in instability terms. But what I've seen time and again, and I go back to my experience in Bosnia, the U.S. taking a leadership role becomes critical to resolution of big conflicts and small.
Yeah.
And there is no other state that has the convening power or will to convene like the United States. So you could take what occurred in Iraq in 2014 when in one go a third of the country fell to ISIS.
Right.
And there was a moment where ISIS was at the gates of Baghdad and the whole country of some 35 million people might have gone and become a caliphate, a terrorist platform. At that first moment, after the fall of these several cities to ISIS, the only other country that put troops on the ground to assist Baghdad urgently was Iran. We put troops in, and we convened and organized what eventually became a coalition of 80-some countries and organizations, not just to offer military assistance, but also stabilization. Where ISIS withdrew, we worked to stabilize those communities. We worked together collectively on counter-radicalization.
Yeah.
So I think that, for me, is the big takeaway. We have to be engaged, not just in the Middle East, globally. We have responsibilities. Otherwise, there is a vacuum or big adversaries who do not have the power or the will to convene for the public good, like the PRC, move in.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to ask you. What would you say to those people, including some who I think are in the Trump administration now, that say America's just paid too much of a burden in this part of the Middle East? And look, China brokered this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023, and it wasn't us, and things move on, and that's okay.
And in fact, one of the last conversations we had with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Secretary Blinken, he heard very clearly from the Crown Prince how deeply he valued the relationship with the U.S. and how his own thinking about the U.S. and the U.S. role in Saudi security and the regional security piece had changed completely over the course of the Gaza conflict, and in no small part because of the way we had worked to tackle the nightmarish security problem presented by the Houthi and the sort of their effort to hold international commerce at bay and to attack Saudi Arabia and other countries. The PRC did nothing.
Yeah.
Did nothing, and that was clearly a case of real disappointment for the Crown Prince, and it had altered his thinking about who is the responsible global actor here.
Right. We're still the strategic,
Yes.
preferred strategic partner choice of most of the actors
Yes,
in the
that's
region.
right.
Maybe one more retrospective
Yes.
question, if you don't mind.
Certainly.
You were in Syria on that trip just earlier this year. How do you look back on the trajectory of U.S. engagement in Syria from the Arab Spring? And I know it was a complicated period. I know people like Secretary Blinken, Samantha Power also expressed regret in terms of how we engaged it. Robert Ford, one of our colleagues here, was ambassador on the ground. I know it's a complicated question, but how do you look at that from the longer term of view and what happened there? And were there missed opportunities in the Arab Spring, or did we do the best that we could at the time?
Look, I was in Basra in February of 2011 when the Arab Spring, it had started in Tunis in December, of course, but as it began to spread, as the effects began to spread, with protests in Egypt and then ultimately in Yemen and Syria, in Libya, I remember thinking, we haven't finished the regime change thing in Iraq. What are we doing here?
Right.
And I feared very much that we were getting very excitable about the degree to which we could, in fact, channel these convulsions, these popular convulsions. And I feared very much that we were going to be in a situation, take October 1956, Budapest, or March of 1991, and the exhortation to the Shia Arabs of the south of Iraq to rise up against Saddam. They did, just as the Hungarians rose up in October 1956, and both communities counted on the U.S. to come in behind them with material support. And of course, we did not.
Yeah.
Which is to say that your question leaves me profoundly conflicted, because I will tell you, as somebody who was responsible for Iraq in 2011 when I came back as Deputy Assistant Secretary, I was not convinced at all that we knew what we were getting into in Syria as we were exhorting Syrians to continue their struggle, which is not to say I didn't want to see Syrians free. And I was so inspired by that sense of liberation when I went to Damascus December 20th. But it's a very weighty, heavy thing. And regime change, especially that fostered by an external power, doesn't always break your way, and doesn't always break the way of the public that got involved.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think, important lessons there and nuance in what you're saying. And you take the big picture when you said earlier in our conversation about Syria and Lebanon today and the need for the U.S. to engage, the need for the U.S. to lead. But what I would also say in terms of trying to sum up what you just said is you got to know the limits of how much we can actually shape and influence events, because sometimes things take on a life of their own.
They
and
do.
You can't control it.
They do. And countries just organically have many their history, their culture, the deep public currents or currents within the public that we cannot see, that we cannot feel, that we cannot understand, and we certainly cannot control.
Yeah, great. I want to ask you one last question, and it's one that I like to ask all my guests. Many of our listeners are younger people in school or at the start of their careers. They look at someone with your biography and the career that you've had, and they want to be just like you. And we have some of them in the room here at the recording right now. What was the initial spark that got you into this? And what would you advise people today who are seeing what's going on right now and things like this? What advice would you give them to if they wanted to follow in your footsteps?
So I'll take the second part first because it's very simple. Go into public service. Go into the foreign service. Like, there is nothing like it for a sense of personal satisfaction, personal achievement. Every day you feel you are contributing in some way as a diplomat. And I always say that on my worst days in the Foreign Service, it was still a good day. Now, as to your first question, what spurred me, I would say two people. My father, who was himself so deeply committed to public service as an Air Force pilot, and who encouraged me all along the way to go where I wanted to go, that I could do anything, whether I was in a male-dominated academic setting or in a professional setting that was male-dominated. And my mother, who gave me a love for the English language and especially grammar. I'm a grammar nerd.
I've heard about this. People who work for you told me how you love to take a pen to their draft memos.
Well, you know, the substance was really important, but so was the grammar. And my pet peeve was misuse of the reported voice. But anyway, I digress. But the love of language and grammar, but the love of language that I got from my mother was transformed into a quest to study other languages. And as I collected languages, I began thinking, well, what am I going to do with this?
What languages do you speak?
So, well, I don't speak all of them well. Let me just be clear. But French, Arabic, Serbo-Croatian, Italian, smattering of German, pretty much non-existent Russian at this point. Yeah. But I tackled these languages and I loved them, and I loved the effort and the intellectual challenge of learning wholly different languages, one from another. But on a very cold morning in December in my sophomore year, I ran into one of my upperclassmen classmates who was rushing across campus. I was on the way to the library, of course, and I asked him where he was going, and he said, well, I'm going to go sit for the Foreign Service exam. And I was like, ta-da, there it is. That's what I should do. Yeah. Now, as a slight segue, I will say that, of course, my father, my mother, they were thrilled at my, what I wanted to set myself to.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I applied for the Peace Corps. And I vividly remember my father's pleading with me not to go off to the Peace Corps. He said, it'll be so dangerous. Just wait till you get into the Foreign Service.
Yeah.
It's much safer.
Right.
And of course, I thought about that many times when I was in a duck and cover situation, Basra,
Right.
and under attack by militias, when I was in the middle of the Intifada, when I was standing on a cold, dark tarmac in Haiti, getting onto a military plane to escort a dictator into exile.
Right.
In a pretty kinetic environment. So it was pretty ironic, but I, my father kind of learned the hard way that he had to gulp hard every time I went over seas. But it was my parents.
Right. So public service,
Even
even in this moment where it looks like there are dark clouds,
you have to take the long view.
you have to take the long view because this is just an episode. Get out and learn languages.
Yes. Push yourself. Just constantly push yourself. Get out and do some traveling. Get out of your comfort zone. I always tell those that I mentor and coach professionally, and not just in the Foreign Service, get outside your comfort zone.
Yeah.
That was part of what I liked about trying Serbo-Croatian. I mean, and going to Bosnia.
Yeah.
Get out of the Middle East, do something really different, test myself, and grow as a result. And do something good for
And
people.
mind your grammar.
And mind your grammar above all.
Well, thank you, Barbara. One final thing before I close, by way of a cryptic inside joke, we'll always have Doha.
We will always have Doha, and soon we will have Muscat.
Inshallah. Thank you, Barbara, not only for joining us on Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, but for your service to America and for everything you've done. I know it's not an easy job that you've had over the years and the risks you've just described. We really appreciate what you've done for us. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
That's all the time we have this week. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in and to our colleagues for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We will see you all here on the next episode.